Time once again for your favorite, sometimes bi-monthly MMA show. It is the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani. Excuse my voice, I have lost it, but the good news is you don't really have to hear much from me on this episode. We've got a great panel, a familiar panel, but with a bit of a twist. I'll get to that in a second. Welcome back to Luke Thomas, the short sleeve wearing Luke Thomas. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Happy to be back.
Good to have him back. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Of course, you know him as Mike Chiappetta. He is now formerly of MMAfighting.com, now with FoxSports.com. Mazel tov.
Thank you, sir.
Good to have you here. He's still part of the family. We still love him anyway. And then it gets really interesting because the man with the hat, Chuck Mindenhall, is here, of course, formerly of ESPN.com, now with MMAfighting.com. I'm having a great time doing this whole format.
You should be the interloper.
This is great. Welcome to the team.
Thanks, man.
Great to have him here. Good to have the usual panel in the house.
The A panel.
Oh, wow. Look at that. Shots fired.
Here we go.
All right, guys, let's get into it. Earlier this week, it was announced that Vitor Belfort is going to fight Dan Henderson for the second time, November 9th in Brazil. Also on Wednesday, Lyoto Machida dropping down to 185 against Tim Kennedy. Chael Sonnen still banging that Vanderlei Silva drum. Let's start with the first of these interesting matchups. Dan Henderson versus Vitor Belfort 2, kind of out of left field, a rematch of a 2006 fight. Do you like this fight for both guys?
Well, I don't hate it, but I think everyone's sort of like, okay, that's weird. It's not weird in a way that's offensive. It's just weird in a way where you're sort of like, I don't understand it. I think it's hilarious, though, because that was the fight in Vegas, I believe, if I'm not correct, at Pride 32, where Vitor Belfort popped positive for steroids, and now they're coming back and they're both on TRT. My, how things stay the same. It's sort of like a full circle of performance-enhancing drugs here. But nevertheless, in terms of like the first fight, it wasn't particularly competitive. If you go back and watch it, it was a takedown fest basically for Dan Henderson. I think now Vitor Belfort is the favorite, so that's sort of an interesting change. Or maybe he will be the favorite. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. I guess in Brazil, everyone who's Brazilian is a favorite. But in terms of why they're fighting, I guess they need to pair stars. Vitor Belfort's sort of erratic rants about wanting to fight Chael and wanting the title shot at middleweight, they're not going to materialize. The UFC seems pretty almost reactionary, giving him the Heisman against those ideas. So why not match it with somebody who can at least headline a card that there is some history there, albeit sketchy. Wasn't my immediate thought. I think other people can think of other permutations that would work, but I don't think in the end it's a terrible idea, just one slightly out of left field.
For me, the whole thing about it is Vitor Belfort sort of caused the situation. You know, he had other matchups offered to him, which he turned down, and I think they got put in a situation where they had to come up with something for him. It's almost like he's trying to protect a title shot that doesn't really exist. That's the weird part of it to me. Because what's the point of going out of your division right now? There really is no point. I mean, like Luke said, I mean, it's an interesting matchup. I don't hate the matchup, but there's just no sense to it. I mean, what happens after this fight? If he loses, is he really protecting that title shot that doesn't exist? No, I think if he loses and doesn't look good in the process, I think it'll affect him even if he goes back to middleweight in the way they book him. So, to me, when I'm trying to think of, I'm looking at it from his point of view. I just don't see what he's getting out of it.
From Hendo's point of view, it's a fantastic fight. I mean, this is a guy, he turns 43 years old tomorrow, August 24th.
Wow.
He'll be 43 years old. He just lost 2 fights in a row. And now he gets a guy who at least is perceivably in the top, right in that title conversation. He beats Vitor Belfort. He's right back into a sort of contention. I don't know if he'll go all the way back into that top 5 or anything like that, but his name is right back in there. Coming off those 2 losses, both of them split decisions. I think it's a fantastic fight for him. It makes all the sense in the world to take that fight. For Vitor Belfort, though, going off of Mike's point, it doesn't make as much sense, but at least he finally found a dance partner.
You know what's weird is like light heavyweight is a bit of a show right now.
Oh my God, it's a mess.
John Jones has beaten everyone anyone cares about, with the exception of we'll see what happens with Teixeira if he gets there, with Pass Bader, and obviously with Gustafsson. Okay, those 2 are great, but after that, it's like people are coming and going. You don't really need to win to get a title shot. It's just a bizarre place. Light heavyweight used to be in the days of Chuck and Tito and Rampage and Dan Henderson previously. It used to be like and then of course Randy Couture. That was the division. That was what in many ways built the UFC. And of course John Jones is the phenom, no doubt about it. But it is sort of noticeable how much that division in aggregate has kind of declined.
I think a lot of that is attributable directly, like you're saying, to John Jones. I mean, he's just that much better than everybody else. The rest of the pack is pretty well they're kind of bunched together. I mean, it's still a very good competitive division, but it's kind of like, when Michael Jordan was in the NBA, he'd embarrass really good players on the regular. John Jones is doing the same thing here.
You have a situation where it's like Phil Davis lost to Rashad Evans, but he beat Nogueira, and Nogueira beat Rashad Evans. Yeah, it's just a weird division where a bunch of guys lost decisions to each other, and it's very hard to rank them. We'll get to the rankings in a second, but Lyoto Machida really wanted to fight Vitor Belfort, and it was rare coming from Lyoto, a guy who doesn't usually get fired up. He had a legitimate beef with Vitor. They didn't go that route. They gave him Tim Kennedy in his middleweight debut, and it's interesting because Tim Kennedy has now been offered 2 high-profile fights after criticizing the UFC. Is this a punishment or a reward for his comments?
It could be either thing. I mean, honestly, when you take a look at Lyoto Machida, it just shows you what a no man's land that guy is in right now. Coming off his loss, no chance of getting another title shot. Been flirting for a while with going down to 185, and can't seem to find a big fight. Well, he has to go to Kentucky now to fight a guy, Tim Kennedy, with the military ties on a card like this. Very strange.
Why are you going to call out Kentucky?
Is that where you're from? But it's a fight that I didn't see coming. There were a lot of possibilities. We were talking about Machida, Belfort. I thought that might get put together. There were a lot of possibilities with Machida, but I didn't see Kennedy coming up. It really could be punishment, honestly, for Kennedy, because they tried to pair him with Vitor Belfort before. It just wasn't accepted.
And it's also interesting. It's like you kind of felt like they didn't really like Tim Kennedy. Remember Dana White said, "Who's Tim Kennedy?" And now they're giving him these 2 fights. Are they trying to build Kennedy into this anti-hero?
I just feel like at the end of the day, even if you're trying to punish the guy, you're giving him a great opportunity, right? So who cares? If I'm Tim Kennedy and they're trying to punish me, they're giving me the best opportunity of my career and my life. So I'd still be happy about it if I was him. For Lyoto Machida, as Chuck said, he's kind of this weird no-man's land. But I think for a long time, a lot of people have wondered, how good could this guy be as a middleweight? Because I think he has a middleweight build. Every time he weighs in, he's 202 and 203. He doesn't cut weight at all. And he's been this good as a light heavyweight. Maybe he's even that much better. I mean, he's already 35. I think he's 35 years old. It would have been nice to see what he could have done if he was really in his prime. He's still very good. It's going to be interesting to see how he does now.
Doesn't hurt that Kennedy is in mint condition. He's had 1 fight in the UFC. He was hit 16 total times, and only once really.
Well, the thing about Tim Kennedy too, though, I mean, if you watch him on Twitter or even in interviews, is it me or has he asked for every available fight that he could possibly get? Constantly.
Good for him.
Just haranguing. It worked.
Yeah.
It worked.
It always works. We've seen that over and over.
Dana White can hate you, but if Joe Silva needs you and Joe Silva knows you're available, they're going to book you. I think it's a pretty simple explanation, really. I think squeaky wheel gets the grease. And credit to him, it's a tough fight. But again, to your point, getting a high-profile fight against a former UFC light heavyweight champion at a Fight for the Troops card, which you mentioned off the air, that's a win. That's a win no matter what. He wouldn't get that fight in Strikeforce. He's got it in the UFC.
The third aspect of these fights between middleweights / light heavyweights is Vanderlei Silva versus Chael Sonnen. Chael wants the fight. Obviously, Vanderlei is kind of playing hard to get right now, but it seems like it's a fight everyone wants. And Dana White said on Fox Sports Live on Wednesday he wants to make it the co-main event of UFC 167. It was interesting. On Saturday, Chael Sonnen looked better than ever. He submitted Shogun Hua. It was a great performance, and all credit to him. But after Vitor Belfort looked great against Luke Rockhold, all anyone talked about was his TRT use. How come that didn't come up once about Chael Sonnen? Was it because he's never tested positive in the past?
Well, I mean, you mean the 117 debacle?
Well, I'm saying for steroids as opposed to elevated levels.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it is. It's a lot of things. I think Vitor Belfort's a weirdo. I think he's not a weirdo. I mean, the guy just says bizarre. Look at his answer the first time Brett Okamoto asked him if he was on TRT. Well, what does God think about our actions? I don't, it's this weird sort of rambling, incoherent seance he was having by himself. Brazilians have charged American media with racism a little bit. I am white, so I'm not in a position to know if maybe I am being prejudiced. I don't know. There is that. Obviously, it also is true that Vitor Belfort did have the 2006 positive test. And of course, he had this radical alteration where I feel like, I think Chael Sonnen's turnaround, he had those 2 bad fights, and beating Shogun, you can at least explain away the Shogun fight because he still fought like a wrestler and Shogun has been so battered and torn. That's not the same as throwing, spinning kicks at age 34 and looking like you're the Incredible Hulk. It's a little bit different. But Why he escapes opprobrium, it's a confluence of factors. But at the end of the day, I just don't think the radicalization that we've seen out of Vitor Belfort, it can be only explained away by, American media is racist. Maybe they are a little bit, but that's not the total answer.
I think we generally tend to correlate PED use with power, right? And Chael, you wouldn't characterize him as like a powerful fighter. He doesn't knock guys out with one strike the way Vitor Belfort is. I think that's the short answer of it. There's a lot more nuance to it, as Luke explained a little bit. But I think that's a big part of it, is the fact that just, we think of steroids, football, big strong guys and baseball guys hitting home runs. Like nobody ever looks at the guys who are, singles hitters in baseball who have juice, or even pitchers who are going to throw harder. It's usually just about power, and we see raw power from Vitor Belfort. And there was also a drop in his career for a little while, and now this revitalization too. Chael's always been, he's always been at a pretty decent level. He raised his game a little bit, but as Luke said, it's always been kind of building on the same thing with his wrestling and grappling. So I think that's one of the reasons.
It doesn't hurt either that he's basically like a master smoke screener. Like he just, you never know what's fact and fiction with the guy. He'll sometimes address the TRT thing directly. Other times he'll just kind of buck it off. I mean, it's a weird. He's got a very strange way of presenting different forms of himself that people just can't get over. And I think, we sometimes lock into a Chael that we like, and that's a weird sort of thing to say, but he's that sort of diverse personality. And, Vitor Belfort, obviously, doesn't have that going for him.
Well, one thing is, like, we're in a lucky position because you've talked to Chael off camera. I've talked to Chael off camera. All of us have. So, sorry, y'all. He's a nice guy. I mean, whatever you think of his misdeeds and conducts in the sport, and whether you think he's a cheater or not, okay, that's a debate to have. As a person, his charm offensive is legitimate. He's on TV all the time, entertaining UFC fans. And when you talk to him off camera, I mean, one time a buddy of mine wrote an article about him, and it was questioning some of his credentials. Chael sent him a very calm email, thanked him for writing about him, and sort of expressed his disagreement in a very professional way. Most fighters get on Twitter and have these rage outs about how you don't know anything. He didn't really do that, And off camera, when I was on the Spike Show, the guy, I wrote an article about him, and it was about his losses. And he thanked me for writing an article about his losses. Legitimately did that. The guy in person is very, very, very hard to dislike, and I think that matters.
Yeah, he is one of a kind. He truly is, on and off camera. But Mike, he wants this Vanderlei fight. As I mentioned, Vanderlei is, playing hard to get. It seems like he probably would have gotten the Vanderlei fight even if he would have lost to Shogun, because it's such a money fight. But I remember talking about this fight. I believe it was on this show, and we spoke about it on the preview show with Dave Doyle last week, thinking that Shogun had more pressure on his shoulders going into this bout on Saturday night in Boston. Now, looking back, I almost feel like Chael had more pressure because of his TV commitments, because he's out there. If he would come back to TV, loser in his last 3 fights, 2 of those fights were very bad losses. We don't know how the Shogun fight would have went. I mean, I think it would have hurt his brand a lot. Don't you agree?
No? I completely disagree, because I think Chael's in a position now that a lot of guys envy. He's got other things going on for him. I mean, he has that job to fall back on. Whenever he wants to hang it up, Fox loves him. He's got this job. He's going to be doing it for a long time to come, and he's very good at it as well. So I think in a sense, he had less pressure on his shoulders, because it's like, whenever I'm done, I have this backup plan. For Shogun, this is his identity. I mean, he's a born fighter. He's a guy that's been a champion, and he's a guy that we've seen struggle through his last couple of years, and I think he's trying to sort of reinvent himself a little bit. He's struggled with it, and when he's done fighting, what's out there for him? I'm sure there's things he could do in Brazil. He's popular there, but for him, I think it's he's younger than Chael as well. I think he's 31 if my facts are right, and Chael's I think 37, so he's younger. I think he probably feels like he has more time ahead of him. He's a former champion. I think for him, it was a bigger fight.
Yeah, and Shogun lost. Yeah. What do you think happens to him next?
With Shogun, I don't know. I mean, to me, he loses a little bit more just the way he lost. He didn't look too impressive in that fight. But I mean, there like we were talking about, the 205-pound division right now is sort of just up in the air between all those guys below John Jones and then a couple of prospects, a couple of guys who might challenge. Everybody else is just in the common lottery at this point. And I think guys like, Little Nog, they were supposed to fight at UFC 161. They could still put that fight together. It still have its pretty much the same intrigue, at least from me, as it would have then. There's guys like, obviously, Gegard Mousasi, if he does fight at 205, somebody like that. There are fights for him out there that he could still have. But I think, the way he lost this fight, it did take off a little more of the shine from where it was before. One thing, though, about in terms of Wanderlei Silva, if you're Wanderlei Silva, this seems like the greatest thing that could happen for you is for Chael Sonnen to go out there. I mean, we remember how Anderson Silva, coming off that UFC 112 debacle in Abu Dhabi, Chael Sonnen was sort of like the life raft that came to him and said, by UFC 117, everybody cared about that fight. He's a master promoter, especially when he dislikes you, which he dislikes Wanderlei Silva. I feel like Wanderlei Silva, who's 4-7 in his last 11 fights. What a great thing for him. He could be a co-main event. As long as he's healthy to do it, it's the greatest thing I think that he could do right now.
On the 20th anniversary show. That's a
20th anniversary show. So I feel like that's, for him, like, it's a no-brainer. As long as he's able to fight, he should take that fight.
And by the way, speaking of Shogun, how about the title fight we never saw? Shogun Hua versus Rashad Evans.
Yeah, well, does anybody really want to see that?
Well, there's not much for Rashad. After the fight on Saturday, Dana White was very into this idea that the media screwing up the rankings. How can you have Chael Sonnen number 8 as a middleweight? Then the rankings come out on Monday night, and Chael's 10 as a light heavyweight, but Shogun is 9. It's kind of a mess right now, the rankings. And I'll weigh in on the rankings in a second and why I think they are fundamentally flawed. But we all know why the rankings came out in the first place. Fox wanted to put them out there, and they serve a purpose, right? You could say number 3 is fighting number 4, number 8 is fighting number 7. It sells a fight. But don't you think it's time that the UFC actually looks at them themselves as opposed to criticizing the media and saying, the way we have this structured, as well as Fight Metric, which kind of houses the whole thing, the way we have this structured is actually wrong. The system makes no sense.
You mean asking the media their opinion?
No. Just asking any sort of person who kind of has some kind of interest in MMA media, in MMA, and then having these guys vote. And we don't know if one guy's a middleweight or a light heavyweight, so if you don't rank him at this division, he drops down because not enough people rank him based on the averages. You know what I'm saying? Yes. It's a fundamentally flawed system.
Yeah, like if I was to think of a rankings panel, if someone said, okay, we need to have a rankings panel, and it has to be made up of MMA media, and you get to pick it, I'd say, okay. 98% of the names on that list today, I would scratch off the list. And in fact, I would have it be very, very narrow. It would include names like Jordan Breen. It would include names like Jack Encarnação. It would include names like people on this panel. It would not include people who, as you mentioned, are morning radio DJs in, some top 50 market in the middle of New Mexico.
It's a problem.
There's top 50 markets in New Mexico.
Well, Albuquerque maybe, I don't know. But the point, you get my point. Like there is rankings. The problem with rankings is everyone's like, rankings don't mean anything. And it's true that they don't mean as much as people want them to mean. But it's also true that the majority of rankings are just done so poorly. Most people are just so inept about rankings. They don't. Why is the champion not ranked and then there's number 1? We're borrowing boxing's architecture, and in boxing's architecture, the reason why they do that is because they are trying to establish contendership. If you've got a guy in Chael Sonnen who, as we mentioned, we deeply admire, but since 2005 has no light heavyweight wins, if you are putting him. Since 2005, the Trevor Prangley win. I mean, hardly relevant.
Shogun.
No, I'm talking before that. Okay. Before the fight. Before the Shogun fight, if you had him ranked, in the top 10 at light heavyweight because of what he did in middleweight, you don't know what you're doing. Fact. If you had Frankie Edgar ranked number 2 after he lost to Jose Aldo at featherweight, you don't know what you're doing. That's a fact. You don't. The rankings, as they're designed, since we're borrowing the architecture from boxing, it's designed to establish contendership, which means who did you beat in that division? And how relevant was it and how recent was it? That is it. That is it. And you got all these guys being like, well, I think Ronda Rousey is number 1 pound for pound because she armbars everyone in the first round. God bless Ronda Rousey. She ain't number 1 pound for pound.
Women or men?
Either, for women, I guess maybe, but certainly not for men. And
right.
certainly not.
Who's ranking her number 1?
There were some debates on Twitter, believe me. So here's my point. Yes, rankings will always be flawed. There will always be debate. There will always be confusion. Even among this panel, I'm sure we would not have consensus. And that's fine. But what you're pointing to is a system that the UFC, they're the ones who created it. And they didn't allow people to rank Chael at first at both divisions. Remember that? Right. That was their fault. They fumbled that execution. So yes, there's lots of problems, but blaming the media, while true, is hardly the sum total of the problem.
And Mike, when the college football writers vote on the top 25 in college football. They're all working with the same teams, and they know, okay, these teams are who I need to rank right now. But like when you can essentially go in. You can put Frankie Edgar at lightweight right now and featherweight. So by doing that, you're splintering the votes. Mm-hmm. It's creating confusion. They need to tell people, all right, these are the top 15 guys. These are right now, and now rank them. And I think that would make this a lot more meaningful because you're not just picking from a massive pool of fighters. And sometimes I bet you some of these guys forget that Chael fought here or Frankie fought here or should be here. It's just a bad system.
Well, I don't know if they should give us the top 15 guys, but I think that they should list fighter, each fighter in each division and let people go from there. I'm not a person who goes crazy about rankings. I really don't care about it much, to be honest with you. I understand its purpose. I agree that it helps people who don't watch that often understand or have a general idea of who belongs where. And I think that's its only use. And as long as you're generally in the right area, I mean...
But if you're going to put it on TV, get it right.
But
because it's no longer just on Sherdog.
What's right in rankings though? There's essentially not a right and wrong. It's just people's opinion. And
how could Dominic Cruz be above Chris Weidman in the pound for pound? He hasn't fought in 2 years. How could Chael be below Shogun?
There are situations like that are
egregious.
Egregious. Great word.
It's silly. It's embarrassing.
But there are divisions like we're talking about light heavyweight, and this guy's beating that guy, and that guy's beating that guy, and so on. It becomes a lot more jumbled and harder to put together. And then you also have to, how far back, like you were saying about, if this guy's beating this guy. Well, you go back a few years, Martin Kampmann beat Carlos Condit. He's ranked below him.
Sure.
Obviously, they've had a body of work since then that plays into it. But my point is, it's not simple. After a while, when you take the entire body of the work, where you take guys jumping between classes, it throws a wrench into the system, and it's not an easy thing to rank, and it's not something I think we need to go crazy about.
It's supposed to be a meritocracy. Establish this meritocracy. This guy has deserves this fight. It helps matchmaking. It helps a frame of reference. I mean, the whole thing that they've been using it for is what makes sense. It was interesting to me that Dana was calling out the media because he was actually adding import to what these are. I mean, they're not real. They are just people's opinion. But when they take on import, when he's actually saying like, Chael Sonnen shouldn't be number 8, not when he beat Yushin Okami and he beat, Bisping with a grain of salt. But I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Like he's beat these guys. He shouldn't be behind them in the middleweight. He's right about that. He shouldn't be behind those guys, not in that division. Now, where it gets complicated is because it is splintered, because he's at 205 as well, and somehow we dilute his 185-pound ranking based on that, which doesn't make any sense. The point he was making was absolutely right. Sonnen should be, in my mind, number 3 in that division. Like there should right around there in that division. There shouldn't be.
And by the way, I wasn't saying he was wrong.
Yeah.
I was saying he should then look at why this happened.
What was funny is usually when you guys were talking about Frankie Edgar, when Dana White was the one who went on and said, hey, it's one of the best pound for pound, he really hammered that point home. People really believed that. Yeah. They really were, they'd keep him in the pound for pound even after his losses, the pound for pound list. He tried that a little bit with Chael Sonnen, maybe helping him up the rungs a little bit again, back into where they want him to be. And he actually moved down a spot from number 8 to number 9, which was really interesting in my mind.
I think it's because more people then went back to the middleweights and bumped them up there as opposed to forgetting
I think the thing with Sonnen,
number 9 is a middleweight.
The Sonnen situation specifically, because I was one of the people that sort of argued with him a little, debated with him at that post-fight press conference. We thought like Chael Sonnen was a light heavyweight, right? Chael went up to 205. He said, "This is my new home." What are we supposed to do? He told us he's a light heavyweight, so why should I even vote for him as a middleweight? Right. Yes, he has done well there in the past. He was a title contender, 2-time challenger for the belt. Great, his resume there is great. He told us he's a light heavyweight. Now I don't vote in the panel. I haven't voted in the past, but I don't blame people who said I'm not going to vote for him at middleweight because he's telling me he's a light heavyweight. So that certainly
skewed it.
Yeah, it skewed his ranking and made him lower than he would have been.
But if he's on that list. If he's on the list, they say that we're ranking him here too, and you're trying to keep that list right. He still has to be in there. Regardless, you can't just ignore him if they're saying we want him and he's included in this picture.
Yeah.
But
Luke, you said earlier that we like Chael because, he'll send you a nice email. Even if you write something negative about him, he won't go on the internet and call you out and say, meet me in the cage. One guy who does do that is Ben Askren, who I guess famously challenged me to a fight after I said his fight against Douglas Lima wasn't all that exciting. Well, he's a free agent, and all of a sudden Bjorn Rebney, the Bellator CEO, has said, you know what? We're probably not going to offer him a deal. He's not everyone's cup of tea, but I'd love to see him fight GSP because I'm that big of a fight fan. Dana White, who once said that, people who need to go to sleep watch Ben Askren fights and other stuff as well.
That's not all he said, Ariel.
And other stuff as well. Now says they are going to talk to Ben Askren.
Yeah.
Where do you think he lands? And also, what do you make of this gamesmanship here between Bjorn and Dana?
Rob Macy, the guy who's been trying to start this MMA trade association, I think had pretty salient analysis about this. It was either on Facebook or Twitter. I can't remember where I saw it. And he basically made the correct point, which is, if you go read that full article on ESPN, Bjorn, he kind of throws Ben under the bus a little bit, even more than a little bit, like, hey, he's not for everybody. Even I went back and watched all the things he said about Alvarez during that crazy time. He did say a lot of things like, I want to see him in the UFC and blah, 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 but he never threw his ability under the bus. Never did it with Hector Lombard either. That was a little bit different. But at the end of the day, Macy asked, did you see at any point Bellator or Rebney say, we're going to waive negotiating period, we're going to make him an unrestricted free agent, he's yours, take him. You never heard him say that. In fact, at the end of the article, he says, look, we'll take a look at any offer the UFC makes. To me, I think what they're trying to do a number of things. They probably want to keep him. They're probably trying to drive his price down and be able to match him. Because obviously, Dana White and Ben Askren have their issues, but it is worthwhile to the UFC to have Ben Askren because they may hate him, but they do want to see how we do against top 10. It's good to take away a top acquisition from Bellator. So all of that makes sense. But if you're asking me, do I really buy the idea that they don't want Ben Askren anymore? I don't buy that. I do think they do, but I think they want him at a price that's a little more affordable.
But doesn't it hurt Bellator to diminish his talent if they really actually want to sign him?
Well, at the end, I do think they want him, again, at a reduced price. So at the end of the day, I think they would like to reclaim him. But at the same time, fight fans have amnesia. Yes, they'll throw him under the bus, and then he'll re-sign, and they'll tell you how great he is. Same thing with the UFC. It's not like Dana White didn't hurt him. He hurt him either with the things he said. So, sure. But if they sign with the UFC, they can make him look 1,000 different ways. At the end of the day, whatever Bjorn might say, that may affect negotiation a little bit, but I do think fans, Ben Askren is like the John Fitch who gave everyone the middle finger. F you, F your mother, F your sister, I'm the greatest, get over it, you suck. And John Fitch never did that. And so I just mean, he's this super hated figure. People either want to see him get smashed or they really want to see how good he is, no matter what Bjorn Rebney or even Dana White might say.
Chuck, what's your take on this whole situation?
It's really difficult. I really believe that Luke is probably on the right track with all of this. I think some of it's just posturing from Bjorn's side. Dana White, you never know. I just can't imagine, though, the UFC coming to the plate and trying to sign him like they did with Eddie Alvarez. That sort of money for a guy. They just got rid of John Fitch. We were talking about John Fitch, who's making a lot. He was making decent money for his tenure. He'd been in for 16 fights. He'd been there for a long time. He was making decent money. He wasn't breaking the bank.
Sure.
And he was 14-3-1 during that time. He was a winner, just like Ben Askren. I just can't imagine that the UFC, as good as it would be to see him kind of against some of the UFC talent, I can't imagine them overspending on a guy like Ben Askren. So I don't know how it'll shake out, but I don't think that it's going to be like the Eddie Alvarez situation.
Luke mentioned fans having amnesia. I think it's a little bit of a different scenario just because it's Bjorn saying it. Dana says things all the time. Dana goes, a little nuts every now and again, and it's memorable. But he's a little more, that's more of his personality. I think for Bjorn to criticize his champion is a little bit of a different scenario, and I think it'll be more memorable if it does come back that they end up matching whatever the UFC offers him, and he has to come back to Bellator. I think that'll stick with him. On the other hand, the fact that Ben has sort of positioned himself to be sort of this heel character could play into that a little bit. Now it's kind of him against his own company in a sense to prove how good he is, and I think that's a good thing. Also, the fact of the matter is, he has really come on in his last couple fights. I mean, he had this reputation as being a boring fighter for the first several fights of his career. The last two fights, he's performed incredibly. I mean, his last fight against Koreshkov was one of the most dominant fights we have seen in a few years. I mean, I think the final strike stat was 248-3. That's ridiculous, right? I think
Didn't
if
seem that close.
one of us fought him, we probably might land 3 strikes in 4.5 rounds. So he has done everything he could to increase his value on the open market, and hopefully he gets to cash in. I do agree that this might be Bellator's tack to kind of lower the market on him a little bit, but the UFC has always said they're in the market for trying to get the best fighters in the world, and there are some people who believe he's in that conversation. So good for him to put himself in that situation.
I will say this: Douglas Lima fight was pretty good.
I know you're a closet pro wrestling fan, and in the world of pro wrestling,
I just can't get enough.
there's something called, good heat and X-Pac heat, bad heat, the kind of heat that we don't like you and we don't even want to watch you. We don't want to buy tickets to see you fight or wrestle. We don't want to see you get beat up. So there's that good heat, the Floyd Mayweather heat. We want to pay to watch you get your ass kicked, and then there's the heat that we don't care. Which heat do you really think Ben Askren has?
Oh, he definitely has.
Do you think people really care about him?
Yes.
Okay.
Tito Ortiz has the one that no one cares about.
Interesting.
If I'm not mistaken, I don't know the pro wrestling nomenclature quite so well, but I
The
think
pro wrestler Tito, or the? I'm just kidding.
I don't even know anymore. But I definitely feel like listen, John Fitch got to the point where people were just like, ugh, he was so good, but it was. He was sort of like quietly shrugging, like, guys, this is who I am, and thanks for the support and my interviews, and he was sort of like drawn on there. Ben Askren is completely different. Ben Askren will get on there and taunt people. Do you guys remember when Dan Hardy lost to, I think, Chris Lytle? And he goes, good, now that he tweeted him the second the fight was over, Ben Askren tweeted Dan Hardy and goes, good, now that you're going to be cut, come over to Bellator so I can whip your ass. Like, he is cruel. He is cruel and evil and vindictive and mean and hilarious. Like he's
lustrous hair.
The point being is, John Fitch sort of said, I'm going to be non-confrontational about everything, except for maybe a few statements he would make in the media. Ben Askren is avowedly confrontational, and also makes a good point. That 2008 U.S. Olympic freestyle team is undefeated in MMA. Every single one who's gone over, and he touts that. He believes he can beat GSP legitimately, and I think some people either want to see him lose because of that, and there's people like us who will think, I don't know if he could beat GSP necessarily. Wouldn't mind seeing him try.
I just hope if the UFC signs him, not only do they play up that tweet Dana had about him, but the infamous video blog when he was on the phone with ESPN saying, you have a guy with an afro on the front page of Sherdog. You remember that?
Clearly.
And we have a fight that you need to promote. Okay, before we move on to our last topic, in a word, UFC or Bellator? Ben Askren's next fight.
UFC.
UFC or Bellator?
I'd say UFC.
Bellator.
Wow, look at that. Guys, beginning next Wednesday, August 28th, begins a stretch of 7 days, 3 UFC events. You've got UFC Fight Night 27, then you've got UFC 164, and then UFC Fight Night 28 from Brazil. Is this too much?
I mean, here I don't even know anymore,
You just got back from vacation.
I just got back from vacation. Dana White's kind of crazy because on the one hand, he is, look what they've done with the UFC. Like we're at a point where is 3 fights, 1 on pay-per-view, 2 on Fox Sports 1 too much? It's almost an absurd question given the relative growth of MMA. On the other hand, this is a guy and Dana White, he doesn't understand the idea that less is more. Because, for example, they asked him, what about Face the Pain, this horrible song that they keep playing? And he treats it like Jimi Hendrix burning his guitar, at the end of the Monterey Pop Festival. This is some reverence you have to pay, heed to because it's so central to UFC identity. And people are like, no, actually, we're kind of tired of it. Thanks. He always believes more is more, more is more, more is more. The truth is, I think that the Condit Kamen fight will tell us a better sense of what ratings will do for Fox Sports 1, has value in that sense. Who doesn't love UFC 164? Sick card, love it, so great. The follow-up one on that second Wednesday, as we mentioned before, the 3 fights on the poster, the flyweight fight, the main event, and then the Jacare fight, those are great. The rest of the card I can do without. I believe that less is more. I think the third ratings of I think the ratings of the third event will suffer. Is it too much? For me personally, it's way too much, but I guess we'll just have to see what the market bears out on this new paradigm about what Fox Sports 1 can really carry.
I think it's fine. I really do. Being a traditional sports fan for a long time, you could find baseball on your television literally for 6 months straight. Every single day for 180 days, plus the playoffs, you can find a baseball game. Same with NBA, same with NHL. Football is the only sport that differs. Obviously, it's so physical. But
MMA is not physical.
no, but I'm saying,
I'm teasing.
fighters
Football
don't
also
fight
the
16
most
times a
popular
year.
of the bunch.
Football also the most popular of the bunch, but they're sort of limited in their schedule. They just can't have guys play in every 3 days. If they could, I'm sure they would.
They would.
They absolutely would. I'm sure they'd play year-round if they could also. So I don't have a problem. And they also space games out. There's games on Sunday and Monday, and it's sometimes Saturday games. There's Thursday games. So NFL does what they can to get games on as often as they can, too. But I don't really have a problem with it. I mean, it's one thing if you were asking fans to pay for every card, if it was all pay-per-view all the time, and you had 3 cards in a week, that I think would be a little too much. It's going to be wallet fatigue. Yeah. But you now, by and large, I think like 60-70% of the cards are going to either be on Fox Sports 1 or Fox Sports 2 now. So
you bring up a fantastic point. Do the pay-per-views suffer because there are so many free cards? Do people say, well, I don't need to pay anymore because I'm going to get a card on a Wednesday for free?
Well, why is that an issue for a fan, though? Like, that's not a fan issue. That's a UFC issue, right? I mean,
the fans are picking and choosing.
Right, but isn't that great for the fans? Isn't that ultimately as a fan what you want? You want to be able to pick and choose. Some people might not watch the free card and might buy the pay-per-view because they think that
when I said too much, I didn't mean just for the fans.
Right.
I meant,
and I'm looking at it from the fan's point of view. Is it too much for the fan to watch? Well, I think it's great. The fan can pick and choose now more often what they want. Maybe they'll watch all 3. Maybe they'll only watch one of them. Maybe they'll only watch the pay-per-view out of the 3. But I think it's great to have that choice as a fan, to see all these different weight classes, see women fighting, all this. I think it's great for
the fight game has always been sort of structured that you would sort of marinate on these fights that were coming up. You had plenty of time to really digest them. The weird thing, it does feel funny to have that many fights coming up, especially with a big pay-per-view at UFC 164. You have a title fight that gets taken away from a little bit because they've got other things going on. They're trying to promote these other fights at the same time. So I agree with the less is more. I don't personally have a problem with it. I think it's just one of those things that you get used to as a fight fan growing up. There's a fight on the horizon and you're sort of thinking about it for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, it's just going to be there. And when they come up this quickly, I couldn't even tell you what's on that Brazil card below those 3 fights because I haven't had time to actually really go through and digest everything. So it does suffer on that level. You don't give it your full attention when you have that many.
It's funny, we haven't talked about this in a while, but every time we do talk about it, and we kind of live in this bubble, the Twitter MMA bubble with the hardcore fans, but every time it even comes up, they always say, stop talking about it. We're happy. We want this many fights. The hardcore fans seem to like it.
Yeah,
it's
I hear it different.
You do hear different.
Oh, yeah, I totally hear different.
They hate when I bring this up.
Well, I mean, there is definitely the people on Twitter who like live and breathe and die for this stuff. That's true. I get that too. I definitely get a lot of people who are like, so who's on this card this time? And
you hang out with the naysayers, let's be honest.
I hang out with a couple naysayers, but I hang out with people who are UFC fans and are MMA fans.
Sure.
But my brother's a typical example. He'll ask who's coming up. He likes what he likes and he doesn't know a whole lot. And I'll mention, he'll be like, pass. The truth is, I agree with Mike that, from the fan experience, who could complain about 2 cards? Only one you got to pay for, and you don't even have to pay for it. You can just watch the other 2, and you'll get good fights for sure. Those cards are good by and large. The Brazil card, a little bit nubs, but it's okay. It is what it is. It's fine, for what it is. But the reality is that Fox Sports 1 card was sensational, and I think anybody who says otherwise is crazy. But that helped cannibalize the rest of the cards in the near future. They had to do a lot to make a sick card, and they did it. Success. But, they had to rob Peter to pay Paul. And I think as long as you do that, that pay-per-view experience, which you are paying for, 164 not necessarily withstanding, can often suffer. That 163, those pay-per-view buys told the truth about it. And the same with 161. These pay-per-view cards, sometimes because of injury, but sometimes because they get thinned out because they have to make sure that Fox gets what they need. And now Fox Sports 1 gets what they need. And the Ultimate Fighter has to be filled and so forth and so forth. They serve so many masters. It's not always the case that they make sure that pay-per-view quality control is always as strong as it needs to be.
I think that Fox Sports 1 rating, when you talk about that,
which is super good, by the way.
One of the most impressive things the UFC has had happen to them in the last 5 years, because for fans to go out and find a new network and watch for that long, those numbers, it was a great card, but it also showed that if the UFC really promotes a card, which they did, they almost forgot about Fox 8, forgot about 163, and really promoted this for several weeks, they promote it and have enough time to promote it and not have so many cards next to it, they can get a big number, even on a brand new network.
And that's what I've always said. When it comes to this too many cards thing, it's really a promotional issue. It's not an issue, a problem for the fans. The fans get to pick and choose. That's great for the fans. I think that fans are the ultimate winners of this because they can skip whatever card they want if they have something to do that night. Well, there's going to be another card in a few days. It's a promotional problem, like Chuck was saying, and Luke as well, with his brother not knowing who's. That's the issue for the UFC. Getting out there, what is this fight? Why is it important? What's the subtext underneath it? That is the issue for them, telling the story of the guys that are in it. It's hard to do when you have 3 cards coming up in a 1 week span. How do they tell all those stories? It's pretty much impossible. So you have to kind of rely on the really powerful, not mainstream, the hardcore base to tune in. You're probably not going to get a lot of mainstream, fans that just happen to swing by because they might necessarily sway stories. So it is a UFC promotional issue. It's not an issue for the fans.
Chuck, you also have to rely on the media to get the word out, right?
Yeah.
Going back to the
and ultimately, it does suffer. Ultimately, when you put all your cards on the table for the Fox Sports one, like you said, I completely agree. They really loaded that card up. And it turned out to be great for them. And honestly, a couple of these cards are fine. They're not, like the UFC 164 card is still pretty good. To come on the heels of something like that,
sure.
Really good card. And the other ones have some intriguing fights at the top and some strong through the middle. I don't feel like this is the perfect example because actually some of these fights are actually really good. They're compelling, they're rematches, etc. But we have seen UFC 161. We've seen some of the times where there were no replacements for injuries, and all that goes on. It does take away from it from a media standpoint because I want to talk about Josh Barnett coming into making his debut. That's a story.
His return. Yeah,
his return. So those are the types of things you want to be able to write about, but when they're all crashing around you so fast, some of those go by the wayside. So
all right, guys, that does it for us. We got to get out of here. Great to have the panel back, the A panel, as Luke called it at the top of the show.
He's going to get his first negative comments from other panelists.
Oh yes,
on YouTube,
creating problems. As always, we want to hear from you guys. Let us know in the comment section below what you thought of our thoughts and maybe some topics you want us to talk about in the future. We're going to be off for the next 2 weeks. We're back after UFC Fight Night 29? 9, yes. That is in Brazil, of course, on Wednesday, September 4th. So stick around. We'll be back with you in September. For Luke, Mike, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the MMA Beat.